The military K9 broke formation in front of 300 people and sprinted straight past the mayor, past the police chief, past 4 decorated soldiers standing at attention, and threw himself at the feet of the school. Janitor nobody had bothered to introduce. Handlers shouted commands. The dog ignored every one of them. Gasps rippled through the crowd gathered outside Lincoln Heights Elementary School that morning. Parents stood up from folding chairs. Veterans in the front row turned their heads in confusion. The German Shepherd, a massive animal named Diesel, dropped to the ground at the janitor's feet and refused to move, his body trembling, his eyes locked on a man wearing a faded gray uniform with a mop still in his hand. The man's name was Walter Briggs. For 11 years he had emptied trash cans, fixed leaky faucets, and waxed floors at that school. Most of the staff didn't know his last name. Most of the students didn't know his first. To them he was simply the janitor, a quiet old man who kept to himself, who never spoke about his past, who showed up before sunrise and left after dark. But Diesel knew something none of them did. The dog pressed his head against Walter's knee and let out a sound that silenced the entire schoolyard, a low, aching whine that didn't belong to a trained military animal. It belonged to something deeper, something that remembered. Master Sergeant Cole Ramirez, the K9 handler holding Diesel's leash, stumbled forward, completely thrown off balance by the dog's sudden lunge. "Diesel, heel! Diesel, down!" He barked the commands. His dog had obeyed 1,000 times in training. This time, nothing. The dog didn't even flinch at his handler's voice. Principal Karen Whitfield stood frozen near the podium, microphone still in her hand, halfway through a speech about Military Appreciation Week. She looked at the janitor, she looked at the dog, and for the first time in 11 years, she actually wondered who Walter Briggs really was, because dogs like Diesel, dogs trained by the United States military to detect explosives and track enemies across hostile terrain, dogs disciplined to obey only their handler do not break formation for strangers. They don't cry for people they've never met, unless, somehow impossibly, they have. And as Walter knelt down slowly, his weathered hand trembling as it reached toward the dog's scarred face, one question hung over the entire schoolyard like a held breath. What did this dog know about the janitor that none of them did? We'll get to that answer. But first, let's go back to understand who Walter Briggs really was and how a man capable of so much ended up invisible to the very community he had spent his life protecting. Walter Briggs woke up every morning at 4:30, long before the sun touched the rooftops of his small Ohio town. He lived alone in a modest one-bedroom house on the edge of Fairview, the kind of house with a sagging porch step and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. There were no photographs on his walls, no medals in frames, no evidence of the life he had once lived. Just a worn recliner, a small television that only got 4 channels, and a kitchen table with a single chair. He had worked at Lincoln Heights Elementary for over a decade, and in that time, he had become something like furniture to the people there. Teachers nodded politely when they passed him in the hallway. Students occasionally said, "Thank you," when he picked up a dropped lunch tray, but mostly they looked right through him, the way people look through someone whose job is to be invisible. Walter never corrected anyone. He never offered more than was asked. When the front office needed his name for paperwork, he wrote W. Briggs and nothing more. When new teachers asked him where he was from, he gave one-word answers and changed the subject. He moved through the school like a shadow, fixing what was broken, cleaning what was dirty, and disappearing before anyone thought to ask him a real question. But there was something underneath that quiet exterior, something the careful observer might have noticed if they'd taken the time to look. The way Walter's eyes swept a room before he entered it. The way he always sat with his back to a wall in the break room, even though no one else seemed to care where they sat. The way his hands, calloused and scarred across the knuckles, moved with a precision that didn't match a man who spent his days mopping floors. Walter had a routine, and he followed it like a soldier follows orders. Up at 4:30. A 5-mile walk before dawn. Rain or snow, no exceptions. Arrive at the school by 6. Work until the building emptied out. Walk home, eat alone, sleep 4 hours, sometimes less. Repeat. He had no family that anyone at the school knew of, no wife, no children, no visitors. The mail carrier once mentioned to a teacher that Walter received almost nothing except a single envelope every few months from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And even that detail had been forgotten within a week. Filed away as unremarkable gossip in a town that had plenty of more interesting things to talk about. If you'd asked anyone in Fairview to describe Walter Briggs in 3 words, you might have heard quiet, old, and harmless. Nobody would have guessed the truth. Nobody could have. Because 18 years earlier, before the grey uniform and the mop and the 4:30 mornings, Walter Briggs had been someone else entirely. A man whose name, when whispered in certain rooms inside the Pentagon, still made grown soldiers stand a little straighter. But that man had been buried, deliberately and carefully, the same way you might bury something too painful to look at. Walter hadn't just retired from his old life, he had erased it, and for 18 years he had nearly succeeded. Until one cold Tuesday morning when the local VFW chapter arranged for a K9 demonstration at Lincoln Heights Elementary, as part of a community outreach program meant to teach children about military service and the dogs that serve alongside soldiers overseas. Nobody thought twice about inviting the janitor to stand near the back of the schoolyard for the assembly. After all, somebody needed to set up the folding chairs. The morning of the assembly started like any other for Walter. He arrived early, unlocked the gymnasium doors, and helped the maintenance crew arrange the folding chairs into careful rows facing the small stage that had been built near the flagpole. He didn't ask questions about the event. He rarely did. He simply did his job, quietly and efficiently, the way he always had. By 9 o'clock, the schoolyard had filled with nearly 300 people. Students sat cross-legged on the grass, in their matching gym shirts. Parents stood along the fence line, some recording on their phones. Local reporters from the Fairview Gazette had set up a small camera near the podium. Principal Whitfield welcomed the crowd, thanking the local VFW post for organizing what she called an unforgettable lesson in courage and sacrifice. Master Sergeant Cole Ramirez stood near the stage with Diesel sitting obediently at his side, the dog's posture rigid and professional, the picture of military discipline. Ramirez had handled K9s for 9 years, 3 deployments overseas, and he carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who had done this demonstration 100 times before. Diesel was 7 years old, a decorated explosive detection dog who had served 2 tours before being assigned to community outreach work. He was, by every account, a model of obedience. Sitting in the front row of folding chairs were several local dignitaries: Mayor Donald Pierce, Police Chief Rene Castillo, and 2 visiting Army officers in dress uniform who had traveled from the regional base to participate in the appreciation ceremony. The atmosphere was warm, proud, and entirely ordinary. Nobody noticed Walter standing near the back fence, leaning on the handle of a push broom, watching the demonstration unfold the way he watched everything, quietly, from a distance, with eyes that missed nothing. The trouble began the moment Ramirez gave Diesel the command to demonstrate a basic obedience routine for the children. The dog sat. The dog heeled. The dog responded to every hand signal with crisp precision, drawing delighted laughter from the younger students. Ramirez smiled, clearly pleased with how the demonstration was going, and began walking Diesel in a slow loop around the stage so every child could get a good look. That was when Diesel's head suddenly snapped toward the back fence. His ears shot forward. His entire body went rigid, the relaxed posture of a moment ago replaced instantly by a tension that radiated through every muscle. Ramirez felt the leash go tight in his hand and looked down, confused, expecting to see a squirrel or a stray cat that had wandered onto the field. Instead, Diesel was staring directly at Walter Briggs. "Diesel heel," Ramirez said, his voice calm but firm, the same tone he had used 1,000 times before. The dog didn't move. A few parents chuckled, assuming this was simply part of the show, a moment of comic relief before the demonstration continued. Ramirez tugged gently on the leash. Diesel planted his paws and refused to budge, his gaze never leaving the old janitor standing quietly by the fence. "Diesel." "Heel," Ramirez repeated, louder this time, an edge of genuine confusion creeping into his voice. Then, without warning, the dog lunged forward with a force that nearly tore the leash from his handler's grip. Ramirez stumbled, caught off guard, and the leash slipped through his fingers entirely. Screams erupted from the crowd. Mothers grabbed their children. The 2 army officers in the front row rose instantly to their feet, hands moving toward instincts they hadn't needed in years. Police Chief Castillo's hand dropped to her radio. For one terrifying second, every adult in that schoolyard believed they were about to witness a trained military dog attack an innocent old man. But Diesel didn't attack. He ran straight to Walter, skidded to a stop at his feet, and dropped into a crouch, his tail tucked, his body trembling, making a sound that no one in that crowd had ever heard a working dog make before. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something that sounded almost like grief. The entire schoolyard fell into stunned silence. Walter stood frozen, his push broom forgotten on the grass beside him, staring down at the massive German shepherd pressed against his legs. His weathered face, usually so carefully blank, betrayed something raw and unguarded for just a moment, something that looked, to anyone paying close enough attention, like recognition. "Sir," Ramirez called out, jogging across the field, breathless and visibly shaken. "Sir, please don't move. I am so sorry. I don't know what's gotten into him. He's never done anything like this in 9 years." Walter didn't answer right away. He simply looked down at the dog, and very slowly, very carefully, he lowered himself onto one knee, the same way a much younger man might have once knelt beside a wounded comrade. Diesel pressed his scarred head into Walter's open palm and let out another low whine, his whole body shaking. "Easy, boy," Walter said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but something in it had changed. The flat, careful tone he always used with strangers was gone. In its place was something steady, something commanding, something that made the hair on the back of Ramirez's neck stand up, though he couldn't quite say why. "Sir," Ramirez said again. Kneeling a few feet away, his hands raised cautiously. "Do you know this dog?" Walter's eyes lifted from Diesel's face to meet the handler's gaze, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. The silence stretched on so long that Principal Whitfield, still holding the microphone near the stage, finally found her voice. "Mr. Briggs," she called out, her tone uncertain, almost apologetic, as though she had suddenly realized she had no idea what she was actually asking. 300 people watched the old janitor kneeling in the grass with a decorated military K9 trembling against his chest. And every single one of them was asking the same unspoken question. Who is this man? And what does that dog know about him that the rest of us never bothered to find out? Master Sergeant Ramirez stood slowly, his training kicking in despite his confusion, and made the only decision that made sense to him in that moment. He didn't reach for the leash. He didn't try to pull Diesel away. Instead, he stepped back and gave the dog space, the way any experienced handler learns to do when an animal is reacting to something beyond ordinary obedience. "Everyone, please stay calm," Ramirez announced to the crowd, raising his voice just enough to settle the rising murmur of confusion rippling through the folding chairs. "Diesel is not a threat. Please remain in your seats." But calm was the last thing anyone in that schoolyard felt. Mayor Pierce had stood up from his chair entirely, his hand resting uneasily on the back of it. The two army officers exchanged a quiet, searching look, the kind of look soldiers give each other when something doesn't add up. Police Chief Castillo had already pulled out a small notepad, an old habit from her years, working patrol, jotting down the time and a brief description of what she had just witnessed. Principal Whitfield made her way down from the small stage, weaving through the rows of folding chairs, her professional smile completely abandoned. She reached Walter and Ramirez just as Walter rose back to his feet. Diesel still pressed firmly against his leg, refusing to let even an inch of space form between them. "Walter," she said carefully, using his first name for what might have been the first time in 11 years of working in the same building. "Can you tell us what just happened? Do you have some kind of history with military dogs?" Walter's jaw tightened. His eyes moved across the sea of faces now staring at him, children clutching their parents' hands, teachers whispering behind cupped palms, the two army officers watching him with an intensity that made his shoulders square instinctively, the posture of a man bracing for an inspection he hadn't expected. "I used to work with dogs like him," Walter said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "A long time ago. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the truth either, not the whole of it, and everyone standing close enough to hear him could sense the careful weight behind those words, the sense that he had chosen each one deliberately, the way a man chooses footholds on a steep and dangerous climb. "What unit?" one of the army officers asked, stepping forward. He introduced himself as Major Daniel Hutchins, his uniform crisped, his tone polite but pointed, the question of a man trained to recognize when something didn't fit the picture in front of him. Walter hesitated. "It was a long time ago, Major. Different world back then." "That's not really an answer, sir," Hutchins said. Not unkindly but firmly, a ripple of murmurs spread through the watching crowd. Someone near the fence whispered loud enough for several rows to hear. "He's dodging the question." A father holding his daughter's hand leaned toward his wife and muttered something about the janitor acting suspicious. The whispers gathered momentum, the way whispers always do in a crowd hungry for an explanation, twisting curiosity into something closer to suspicion. Walter heard every word. He had spent his whole life learning to hear things other people missed, and the murmurs of doubt rolling through that schoolyard landed on him like small stones. But he didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood there, one hand resting on Diesel's broad head, absorbing the judgment of strangers the same way he had absorbed worse things in places far from that quiet Ohio schoolyard. Ramirez, watching the dog rather than the crowd, noticed something the others missed. Diesel hadn't relaxed at all. If anything, his posture had shifted into something protective, his body angled slightly in front of Walter's legs, as though the animal had decided, all on his own, that this old janitor needed defending from the very people asking him questions. "He's guarding him," Ramirez said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough that Hutchins turned to look. "What was that, Sergeant?" "Diesel is guarding him, sir," Ramirez repeated, more certain this time. "Look at his stance. That's not aggression toward the crowd. That's a protective posture. I've seen it exactly twice in 9 years, both times with handlers Diesel had bonded with during deployment. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Sir, I don't think this is the first time these two have met. The crowd's murmuring sharpened into something closer to disbelief. Principal Whitfield's hand drifted to her mouth. Mayor Pierce sat back down slowly, as though his legs had simply stopped wanting to hold him up. That's not possible, Whitfield said softly. Walter's worked here 11 years. He's never once mentioned any military background. Not on his application. Not in any conversation I've ever had with him. 11 years is a long time to hide something. Police Chief Castillo said quietly, still writing in her notepad, though her tone carried no accusation, only a growing curiosity that mirrored everyone else's. Walter remained silent through all of it, his eyes fixed somewhere distant, somewhere far beyond the schoolyard fence, the folding chairs, and the curious faces of people who had walked past him in hallways for over a decade without ever truly seeing him. It was Diesel who broke the silence again. The dog suddenly turned his head toward Walter's hand, the one resting against his fur, and very gently, very deliberately, pressed his nose against a thin white scar that ran across Walter's knuckles, a scar that had been there so long Walter himself sometimes forgot it existed. The dog sniffed it once, twice, and then let out the same low, mournful whine he had made when he first ran across the field. That's a contact wound, Major Hutchins said abruptly, stepping closer, his trained eye recognizing the scar's shape immediately. Shrapnel, maybe. Close range. He looked up at Walter with new intensity. Where did you get that, sir? Walter's hand instinctively curled inward, an old habit of hiding what he'd spent 18 years trying to forget. It's old, he said simply. Doesn't matter anymore. It matters to him, Ramirez said, nodding toward Diesel, who was now resting his entire head against Walter's forearm, eyes half closed, the tension finally beginning to drain from his powerful frame, replaced by something that looked almost like exhaustion or relief. Hutchins studied Walter for a long moment, the kind of look a man gives when pieces of a puzzle are sliding into place faster than he can fully process them. Sir, I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. He glanced at Diesel, then back at Walter. What's your full name? The schoolyard had gone almost completely silent now, 300 people leaning in, straining to hear, the only sound, the soft rustle of wind through the flagpole rope, and the faint, steady breathing of a dog, who seemed to already know an answer, the rest of them were still waiting for. Walter looked at the Major, then at Ramirez, then down at the dog who had just upended 11 years of careful, deliberate invisibility in the space of 60 seconds. Walter Briggs, he said quietly. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it actually was, he added 4 more words that made Major Hutchins's face go pale. Used to be Master Chief. A collective gasp rolled through the crowd like a wave breaking against the shore. Mayor Pierce's mouth fell open. Principal Whitfield's hand pressed flat against her chest. Police Chief Castillo stopped writing entirely, her pen frozen mid-sentence. Master Chief, Hutchins repeated slowly, the title carrying weight that every military person in that crowd immediately understood, even if the civilians needed a moment to catch up. Master Chief of what unit, sir? Walter's gaze dropped to Diesel one more time, and something in his expression softened, the way ice softens at the very first hint of spring. Naval Special Warfare, he said, 26 years. Retired as a Command Master Chief out of Coronado. He paused, drawing a slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes before stepping through a door he has avoided for a very long time. I trained dogs just like him, trained handlers too, Before that, I ran joint operations with K9 units across 3 different theaters. The schoolyard erupted into a storm of whispers, gasps, and disbelief. Parents turned to each other with wide eyes. Teachers who had walked past Walter in the hallway 1,000 times without a second glance now stared at him as though seeing him for the very first time. A young boy near the front, maybe 8 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked loudly, "Mum, is the janitor a superhero?" But it was Diesel's reaction that silenced the crowd completely. The dog rose to his feet, sat back on his haunches directly in front of Walter, and lifted one paw, placing it gently against Walter's chest, almost like a salute, almost like something rehearsed 1,000 times in a life none of them had witnessed. Ramirez stared at his own dog in stunned amazement. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice thick with disbelief, "I think Diesel already knew exactly who you were before any of us figured it out." What do you think Diesel recognized first? Was it the scent on Walter's skin? Some echo of gunpowder and desert sand that never fully washed away? Was it the sound of his voice, that quiet command he gave without even realizing he still had it in him? Or was it something deeper? Something dogs seem to carry that we don't fully understand, a memory written into instinct rather than thought? Let us know what you believe before we tell you the rest, because the truth, when it finally surfaced, would explain not just why Diesel reacted the way he did, but why a man capable of so much had spent 18 years hiding behind a mop and a push broom in a small Ohio elementary school. Major Hutchins excused himself for nearly 20 minutes, stepping away from the gathered crowd to make several phone calls on his secure line back to the regional base. The assembly organizers tried, with limited success, to keep the children occupied with snacks and a brief recess, while the adults stood in tight, murmuring clusters near the fence. Speculating about what they had just witnessed, Walter sat quietly on an overturned crate near the equipment shed, Diesel curled at his feet, refusing every attempt by Ramirez to coax him back onto his official leash duties. Principal Whitfield brought Walter a bottle of water, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. 11 years, and I never once asked you about your life before this school. I just assumed you didn't want to talk about it, so I never pushed. Most people don't want complicated answers," Walter replied, turning the water bottle slowly in his calloused hands. "Simple is easier. Quiet is easier. Why did you hide it?" she asked, the question gentle, free of judgment. Walter was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "Because the man I used to be cost me things I'm not proud of, people I couldn't save, choices that still wake me up some nights." He glanced down at Diesel, who lifted his head as if sensing the shift in his tone. It was easier to become nobody than to keep being someone who remembers all of that. When Major Hutchins returned, his expression had changed entirely. Where there had been confusion and suspicion, there was now something closer to disbelief mixed with quiet awe. He carried a tablet in his hand, and behind him walked 2 more uniformed officers who had apparently driven over from the base the moment Hutchins made his calls. "Master Chief Briggs," Hutchins said, and the formality in his voice made several nearby parents straighten up instinctively, as though they too had just been called to attention. "I pulled your service record, or what's left of it that isn't still classified." He held up the tablet, though he didn't turn it toward the crowd. "Sir, do you have any idea what kind of reputation you left behind?" Walter shook his head slowly. "I left it behind on purpose, Major. Didn't exactly keep tabs on it." 26 years of service, Hutchins continued, reading carefully from the screen. 3 bronze stars, a silver star with Valor device, multiple commendations for K9 handler training programs that are still being used today, sir. programs you personally developed for working dogs in high-stress combat environments. He paused, looking up. Sir, there's a training manual still in circulation. That doesn't have your name attached to it anymore because it was scrubbed for operational security, but every handler who comes through the program learns techniques you wrote almost 20 years ago. Ramirez's jaw dropped. Sir, he said, turning to Walter with something close to reverence in his voice. The bonding protocol I used with Diesel when he was a puppy, the one that taught him to recognize protective postures around wounded handlers, that came from a manual we just call the Coronado method in training. Half the handlers in my unit don't even know who wrote it. He shook his head slowly. It was you. The whole time it was you. A hush fell over the gathered crowd, broken only by Diesel's contented sigh as he rested his head against Walter's boot. There's more, Hutchins said quietly, his tone shifting into something more careful. Sir, there's a note in your record, heavily redacted, about an incident 18 years ago. A joint operation involving a K9 unit pulled from a collapsed structure during an overseas deployment. The handler didn't survive, but the report says a senior NCO carried the dog out under fire, despite serious shrapnel injuries to his own hands and forearm. He looked directly at Walter. Sir, was that you? Walter's hand instinctively brushed over the thin, white scar on his knuckles, the same scar Diesel had pressed his nose against minutes earlier. The schoolyard waited in absolute silence for his answer. That dog's name was Bravo, Walter said finally, his voice low and rough with old grief. He was 3 years old. His handler was a corporal named Danny Whitlock, 22 years old, married just 6 months before deployment. Walter's eyes grew distant, fixed on something none of them could see. The building came down fast. I got to Bravo before the secondary collapse, but I couldn't reach Danny in time. He swallowed hard. I carried that dog out myself because nobody else could get close enough. And because leaving him, there felt like losing one more person I couldn't save. Principal Whitfield's eyes filled with tears. Several parents in the crowd had gone completely still, hands pressed over their mouths. Even Mayor Pierce, a man known throughout Fairview for his stoic public demeanor, wiped quickly at his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Bravo was reassigned after that, Hutchins said softly, scrolling further through the record on his tableter, trained for a domestic K9 unit. Records show he served another 6 years before retiring. He looked up slowly, his expression carrying the weight of a realization he could hardly believe himself. Sir, do you know which K9 program eventually trained Bravo's successor line of working dogs? Walter shook his head. Hutchins turned the tablet around for the first time, revealing a faded photograph pulled from an old service file. It showed a much younger Bravo standing beside a litter of German Shepherd puppies at a training facility, each one destined for a different branch of military service. Ramirez leaned forward, studying the photograph intently, then looked down at Diesel with something between shock and wonder. Sir, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Diesel's bloodline traces back through that exact training program, 3 generations removed. He looked up at Walter, his eyes wide. Master Chief, I think Diesel didn't just react to your scar or your voice. I think somewhere in his training, in everything passed down through generations of working dogs bred and conditioned through programs you helped build, there's something in him that recognized you before any of the rest of us had a single clue who you were. The crowd erupted into a wave of stunned murmurs and disbelieving whispers, the pieces finally clicking together into a picture so much larger than anyone in that schoolyard had imagined when they woke up that morning, expecting nothing more than a pleasant community assembly. Have you ever wondered if the loyalty a dog shows isn't just about one single bond, but something carried forward across years, across generations, passed down the same way courage and sacrifice get passed down in families who serve? Maybe that's exactly what happened in that schoolyard. Maybe it wasn't just a dog recognizing a man. Maybe it was something deeper finding its way home. The final piece of the truth arrived almost an hour later, when a black government sedan pulled quietly into the school parking lot and a tall, gray-haired man in a perfectly pressed navy uniform stepped out, moving with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had traveled a long way and intended to make every step count. His name, as Major Hutchins quickly informed the stunned crowd, was Rear Admiral Thomas Whitlock, retired. The same surname as the young Corporal Walter had spoken about minutes earlier, the handler lost in that overseas collapse 18 years ago. Walter rose slowly to his feet as the Admiral approached, Diesel rising with him, pressed protectively against his leg. For a long moment, the two older men simply looked at each other across the schoolyard grass, 300 onlookers holding their collective breath. "Master Chief Briggs," Admiral Whitlock said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he clearly fought to control. "Do you have any idea how long the Navy has been looking for you?" Walter blinked, genuinely caught off guard for what might have been the first time all day. "Sir, I retired 18 years ago. I didn't think anyone was looking for anything. My son was Corporal Danny Whitlock," the Admiral said, and the schoolyard went utterly silent at those words. "Danny's wife wrote to me every year for 10 years, asking if anyone ever found out who pulled Bravo out of that collapse. The report was sealed for operational reasons, your name redacted along with half the details, and by the time the restrictions lifted, you'd already vanished. Retired quietly, no forwarding address, no contact, nothing." He paused, his composure cracking just slightly. "We searched for years, Master Chief. We wanted to thank you. We wanted Danny's daughter, who was born 4 months after he died, to know the name of the man who saved her father's dog when nobody else could reach him." Walter's throat worked silently for a moment before he could speak. "Sir, I didn't think anyone would want to find a man who couldn't save the one life that mattered most that day." "You saved a life that mattered, too," Admiral Whitlock said firmly, stepping closer, his eyes glistening. "Bravo lived another 6 years after that day, Master Chief. 6 more years of service, 6 more years protecting other handlers, 6 more years that wouldn't have happened without you." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, his hands not entirely steady. "This belongs to you. It should have been presented 18 years ago. The Navy doesn't forget its own, Master Chief, even when its own tries very hard to disappear." Inside the box was a medal Walter had never seen in person, a commendation he hadn't known existed, awarded for actions the official record had nearly buried entirely. The schoolyard, already stunned into silence, seemed to hold its breath collectively as Admiral Whitlock pinned the medal to Walter's gray janitor's uniform with the same careful precision he might have used on a formal dress jacket decades earlier. Diesel sat perfectly still throughout the entire ceremony, watching with an intensity that suggested, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that he knew exactly how much this moment mattered. "There's one more thing," the Admiral said, his voice softening. He turned and gestured toward the sedan, where a young woman in her early 20s had been waiting, watching the entire exchange from a respectful distance. She approached slowly, her eyes red, a folded photograph held carefully in both hands. "Master Chief Briggs," Admiral Whitlock said, "this is my granddaughter, Danny's daughter. She's never met the man who carried her father's dog out of that building. She's wanted to thank him her entire life." The young woman stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My mum always told me that whoever saved Bravo gave my dad's memory one more chapter. Bravo protected other soldiers for 6 more years because of what you did that day." She held out the photograph, an old, slightly faded picture of a smiling young soldier with his arm around a German shepherd, both of them squinting into bright desert sunlight. "I just wanted you to know his name wasn't forgotten, and neither was yours, even when you tried so hard to make sure it would be." Walter took the photograph with hands that shook for the first time all day, staring down at the image of a young man he had failed to save and a dog he had refused to leave behind. 18 years of carefully constructed silence cracked wide open in that single moment, standing in a schoolyard surrounded by children, teachers, and strangers who had spent over a decade walking past him without a second glance. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice breaking on the words. "Thank you for not letting him be forgotten." Diesel rose and pressed himself against Walter's legs once more, and this time, when he looked up at the old janitor, his tail wagged slowly, steadily, the posture of an animal who had just witnessed something profound settle into its proper place. The applause started slowly, almost hesitantly, a few uncertain claps near the front row, but it built quickly into something thunderous, 300 people rising to their feet together. Students and parents and teachers and veterans all standing in tribute to a man they had known for 11 years without ever truly knowing him at all. Principal Whitfield, tears streaming freely down her face, stepped to the microphone with a voice that shook with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "I think we owe Master Chief Walter Briggs a long-overdue introduction." Major Hutchins stepped forward and offered Walter a crisp, formal salute, an honor typically reserved for active ceremonies, not elementary school parking lots. Ramirez followed suit immediately, and within seconds, every uniformed person in that schoolyard, the police chief, the visiting officers, even the mayor in his own civilian way, stood at attention, honoring a man who had spent nearly 2 decades believing his service no longer mattered to anyone. In the weeks that followed, Fairview changed the way it saw its quiet old janitor. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "The Hero Hiding in Plain Sight," detailing as much of Walter's service record as remained unclassified. Veterans from 3 surrounding counties reached out, some simply to shake his hand, others to thank him personally for training programs that had saved their own working dogs' lives decades earlier. The school board, in a unanimous and emotional vote, renamed the small courtyard outside the gymnasium Briggs Square with a modest plaque honoring his service, though Walter insisted, quietly but firmly, that the plaque say nothing about medals or rank, only this: "In honor of those who serve without needing to be seen." Master Sergeant Ramirez requested, and was eventually granted, special permission to bring Diesel back to visit the school every few months. The dog never failed to find Walter the moment he arrived, trotting past every distraction, every excited child reaching out to pet him, straight to the old man, who now greeted him not with a careful, guarded expression, but with open arms and a smile that had been buried for 18 long years. Walter still wakes up every morning at 4:30. He still takes his 5-mile walk before dawn. He still works at Lincoln Heights Elementary, mop in hand, fixing what's broken, cleaning what's dirty. But something has changed in the way people greet him in the hallways now. Teachers ask about his day and actually wait to hear the answer. Students wave and call him by name, not the janitor, but Mr. Briggs, sometimes even Master Chief, a title he still isn't entirely used to hearing out loud after so many years of silence, On quiet afternoons, when the school empties out and the hallways grow still, Walter sometimes sits on the steps near the flagpole, looking out at Briggs Square, remembering a young corporal named Danny Whitlock and a brave dog named Bravo who never stopped serving, even after the man he loved most was gone. And he understands now, in a way he couldn't have understood 18 years ago, that hiding from the past doesn't heal it. Sometimes healing arrives on four paws, refusing to let you disappear, insisting, in the most stubborn and loving way possible, that you still matter. Diesel, for his part, never goes back to ignoring Walter on his visits to the schoolyard. Handlers come and go, ceremonies happen and end, but every single time that German Shepherd steps through the school gates, he finds Walter first, the same way he did that very first morning, the same unwavering, instinctive loyalty that started this entire story, with a single dog-breaking formation in front of 300 strangers. Because some bonds don't need to be taught. Some bonds simply remember. Have you ever known someone who carried a quiet kind of greatness? Nobody else seemed to notice. Maybe it was a grandfather who never talked about the war. Maybe it was a neighbor who kept to themselves, but always seemed to know exactly the right thing to do in a crisis. Maybe it was someone you walked past every single day without ever asking who they really were. Tell us about that person in the comments below. We would love to hear their story. If this story touched your heart, consider leaving a like so more people can discover stories like this one. Stories about loyalty that never fades, about service that asks for nothing in return, about the quiet heroes who walk among us every single day without ever needing recognition to keep doing what's right. Here at K9 Heroes Uncovered, we share stories of loyalty, courage, and unforgettable bonds between the bravest dogs and the people who love them. If these stories mean something to you, please subscribe, because we have so many more waiting to be told. Share this story with someone who loves dogs, who loves veterans, or who simply believes that every act of quiet courage deserves to be remembered. And tell us where you're watching from today. We always love hearing from this incredible community, because somewhere out there, right now, there is probably another Walter Briggs, mopping a floor, mowing a lawn, sitting quietly on a park bench, carrying a story of courage and sacrifice that the rest of the world has simply forgotten to ask about. Maybe the next time you meet someone who seems ordinary, ask one more question than you normally would. You never know whose story you might be lucky enough to hear.